when the shore was the edge of the world. Before anyone crossed an open ocean on purpose, the sea was not a highway. It was a boundary. For most people, the world ended where the land ended. Villages woke to the slow sound of waves touching the shore and slept to the same rhythm. Children played at the edge of the water, letting the foam wash over their feet. Fishers pulled small boats onto sand, never too far from the land they knew so well. The sea was there every day, but it was not yet a place to travel through. It was a place to look at. On countless coasts, rocky, sandy, marshy, or ringed with cliffs, people lived close enough to hear the ocean breathing. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. Birds circled overhead, crying in long, echoing calls. The horizon stretched as a quiet, unbroken line, neither inviting nor threatening. Just constant. In the early mornings, when the light was soft and pale, the horizon blended with the sky. The ocean surface became a sheet of muted silver, gently moving, never fully still. From the shore, it looked endless, as if there were no other land beyond it at all. Most people were content not to know what lay past that line. They had enough to understand on land, fields, rivers, forests, stones, seasons. The ocean was for food, not for answers. Small boats, hollowed logs, simple rafts and paddled crafts ventured just far enough to catch fish or gather shellfish from shallow areas. The shore was always visible. The land was always close. Yet even in these early times, there were some who looked at the sea differently. They stood a little longer at the edge of the water. They watched not only the waves, but the pattern of the waves. They listened not only to the sound of the surf, but to the rhythm behind it. They noticed how the wind slid across the surface, how certain currents always seemed to push in the same direction, how certain birds flew out across the water and returned from the same place. They did not call themselves navigators. They did not call themselves explorers. They were simply people who noticed. At low tide, when stretches of wet sand and rocks emerged from beneath the water, these observers walked farther along the shoreline than others. They touched the exposed stones and watched how tiny pools remained behind, holding small creatures, crabs, snails, fish no larger than a hand. They learned that the sea did not always sit in one place. It rose and fell, breathed in and out. The tides were a kind of clock, though no one had yet named them so. Certain communities, living on long, curving coasts, came to understand that the sea was not uniform. Some parts were calm and shallow, others deep and rough. Some stretches always seemed to carry driftwood in from somewhere far away. Others brought strange shells or unfamiliar seeds washed up from invisible shores. People looked at these unfamiliar objects with quiet curiosity. A seed that did not match any local tree. A carved piece of wood in a style no one recognized. A shell of a shape no one had seen before. These small clues hinted at something important. The ocean connected their land to somewhere else. Somewhere they had not yet seen. But the idea of crossing open water, leaving the safety of the shore, was not an easy one. The sea was powerful. It changed moods quickly. Gentle ripples could become tall waves. Clear skies could disappear under low, heavy clouds. A boat too far from land might find, suddenly, that there was nowhere to run when the weather turned. So, for a long time, navigation remained close to the coast. Early navigators learned to follow the shape of the land. They memorized the outlines of bays and headlands, the positions of rocks jutting from the water, the lines of cliffs against the sky. They learned which parts of the coast were safe in the north wind and which were better in the south wind. They memorized where fresh water could be found, where safe beaches offered shelter, where currents tried to pull boats away from land. They did not have maps. They became the maps. Their memory held the coastline like a long, drawn line inside the mind. Each bend, each inlet, each rocky outcrop had a place in that invisible drawing. The early ocean navigators carried this internal map with them whenever they pushed their small boats onto the water. In the calmest of days, some ventured a little farther from shore than others. Just far enough that the land looked a bit smaller. Just far enough that the sound of the waves on the beach grew faint. Their hearts beat faster, but they watched carefully. They noticed how, if they faced back toward land, certain hills lined up with others. How a distinctive peak always appeared above a particular section of coastline. They noticed how clouds tended to gather above mountains, making distant land visible even when it lay low behind the horizon. The sea was slowly revealing itself not as a barrier, but as a space between shapes, between landforms, between islands, between one known place and another. On clear nights, those same early navigators lay on their backs beside their boats and looked up. The stars glittered in enormous numbers, shimmering softly above the black sea. Reflections of starlight trembled on the water. The sky felt almost as vast as the ocean. They did not know constellations by the names we use now. They knew the sky in a more direct way. They recognized a crooked line of bright points that rose in a certain part of the year above one stretch of coast, and in another part of the year above a different stretch. They noticed a bright star that seemed to stay in one general direction, while others wheeled slowly around it. They noticed that if they traveled along the same coast at night, the sky changed in predictable ways as they moved. Little by little, the world was giving them clues. The land had shape. The sea had currents. The sky had patterns. Some people began to join these three observations together in their minds. They did not yet dare to cross open ocean. But the idea that it might be possible someday had quietly entered human thought. It did not arrive with a shout, but with a whisper. And the ocean, which had once seemed only dangerous and strange, began to feel, very slowly, like something that could be read. Not controlled. Not tamed. But read. The story of early ocean navigators began there. At the blurred edge between shore and sea. Between fear and curiosity. Between staying and wondering what might lie beyond. Boats gradually changed. What began as simple logs, crudely hollowed, became more refined. People learned which trees floated best, which shapes cut the water smoothly, which edges balanced well in waves. Some lashed multiple logs together, making rafts that spread weight across the surface. Others learned to bend planks of wood, shaping hulls that could rise over small waves instead of being swallowed by them. Still, these were not yet the great seagoing vessels of later centuries. They were modest, cautious craft, made for coasts, not for open horizons. Yet even these modest boats taught important lessons. The first lesson was rhythm. Anyone who paddled along a shore for more than a short distance felt the push and pull of the waves against the hull. They felt the way certain strokes moved them farther with less effort, how pushing in sync with the small rise and fall of the water made travel easier. They learned to move with the sea, not against it. The second lesson was distance. A short paddle from one fishing cove to the next revealed that the coastline, when followed carefully, was more connected than it seemed from land. A headland that once felt like the end of the world became simply a turn in the path. A distant point that looked unreachable from the beach became ordinary once a boat had rounded it and found another stretch of shore beyond. Little by little, here expanded. The third lesson was direction. At first, early navigators hugged the coastline tightly. Land was always on one side of the boat, a solid line they could see and trust. But sometimes fog rolled in, hiding the land. Sometimes darkness arrived sooner than expected. Sometimes rain blurred the outlines of cliffs and hills. In those moments, the navigators learned to notice other guides. They watched the shape of the waves, long swells that always seemed to roll in from a particular direction. They felt the wind on their faces and the way their boats drifted when paddles rested. They learned that when land was hidden, the sea still remembered where it was. Currents flowed along the shore in certain directions more often than others. The navigators sensed this over time. They knew that if their paddles rested and the boat drifted a certain way, the land lay to one side rather than the other. They did not have compasses. The boat itself was their compass, and the sea was the needle. In calm weather, some navigators tested themselves. They pushed slightly farther from land than necessary, then tried to return without looking directly at the shore. They watched the sky, the birds, the waves, then turned their boat slowly and paddled until, gradually, the coastline reappeared. Each successful return quietly strengthened their confidence. Some coasts contained chains of small islands. These islands became stepping stones. Navigators learned to move from one to another, rarely losing sight of land entirely. The distance between islands might be short enough that the far shore was always visible, or long enough that it disappeared briefly behind the curve of the earth. When that happened, the navigators discovered a new feeling. The feeling of being surrounded by water with no land in sight. Their hearts beat faster when the island behind them sank below the horizon and the island ahead had not yet appeared. For a short time, the world was nothing but sea and sky. In those moments, early navigators relied on everything they had learned: the direction of the swells under the boat, the wind pressed against their cheeks, the line where sea met sky, and the faint path of the sun or stars above. And then, at last, a faint shape would rise from the horizon, the next island. Relief would wash through them, soft and deep. These experiences changed how people thought. The world was no longer simply land with water at the edge. It was a land connected by water. The ocean became a path, even if that path was still narrow and cautious. Coastal communities began to exchange more than just goods. They exchanged knowledge, stories of currents, of hidden reefs, of favorable winds. They described bays that offered safe anchorage during storms, promontories that created dangerous whirlpools, headlands under which the water always ran fast. Some of these early navigators never saw themselves as doing anything unusual. They were just the ones who went a little farther than others. But their experience formed a new kind of memory in human history. A memory of movement across water. At night, after a day spent traveling along the coast or between islands, these navigators sometimes left their boats on the beach and lay down on the sand. Above them, the sky turned slowly. The same stars they had learned to recognize at home now shone over unfamiliar shores. The sky, they realized, did not belong only to one village or one coastline. It followed them wherever they went. That realization took root quietly. If the sky could be trusted in different places, perhaps it could be trusted in between places too. In the open water. In the long stretches where no land showed itself at all. For now, only a few dared to think such thoughts. But the idea was there. The early ocean navigators did not set out to change the world. They simply wanted to fish a bit farther, trade a bit wider, visit the next bay, the next island. Yet with each cautious journey, with each memorized headland and trusted current, they slowly stretched the boundary of what humans believed possible. And the sea, patient and vast, watched them learn, and more deeply connected to survival. The ocean had pathways. Not visible ones, not marked by buoys or signs, but pathways made of movement, steady flows beneath the surface, long lines of drifting water that carried anything placed upon them, seeds, seaweed, carved wood, birds resting after long flights. Early navigators did not see these currents at first. They felt them. A fisher pushing his small canoe into the water noticed that paddling in one direction required more effort than paddling in another. A group returning from a nearby island found that their boat drifted slightly sideways, even when paddles rested still. Children floating in shallow waters felt themselves slowly pulled along the beach even when they did not move. These tiny, everyday sensations became the beginning of knowledge. The currents seemed to remember where they came from. Some always pushed toward the north. Some always slid toward the south. Others circled between islands, creating slow, invisible loops. At first, people treated these patterns like quirks of the sea, unpredictable, unavoidable. But over time, the navigators realized something remarkable. The currents were not random. They were consistent. One elder navigator, known for his calm way of studying the water, spent many seasons observing how floating leaves traveled. He would place a leaf gently on the surface near a quiet cove and watch it drift. Sometimes he followed it along the shore, walking slowly, letting the tide carry it ahead. Other times he sent a piece of thin bark into deeper water and waited to see where the currents took it. He learned that certain coves were gateways, places where water always entered or exited. He learned that headlands shaped currents around them like soft hands guiding a stream. He learned that islands formed invisible trails in the water, long shapes that extended beyond the land itself. One day, as the sun dipped low and painted the ocean in warm orange light, he spoke to a young apprentice. "The sea is not empty," he said softly. "It is a road that moves." The apprentice looked at the water, puzzled. "How can a road move?" he asked. The elder smiled gently. "It moves," he said, "but it moves the same way every time." This was the first understanding of what later generations would call navigation by current. People learned to recognize how the water pressed against the side of a boat. They memorized the sensation of a particular current pushing lightly or firmly. They learned to angle their strokes not simply forward, but diagonally, working with the water rather than fighting it. Some navigators closed their eyes while traveling between familiar islands, feeling the boat's subtle tilt and drift. The sea spoke through these sensations, and experienced navigators understood the language. The ocean became not a barrier but a moving landscape with hills and valleys made of water itself. Navigators discovered fast water zones, places where currents carried their boats swiftly, allowing them to reach distant shores with less effort. They also found slow water areas where the sea felt heavy, as if resisting movement. They learned to avoid eddies that spun their boats around. They learned to identify calm patches that signaled underwater rocks or reefs. The more they observed, the more they understood that the sea had structure, even when the surface looked flat and endless. The currents created a hidden map, one that could not be drawn, only remembered. Travel between islands became smoother. Trade routes expanded. Distant communities that had once seemed unreachable became familiar. Some navigators spoke of the sea as a living companion. Not a creature, not a deity, but a presence with its own rhythm. A presence that guided those willing to pay attention. Certain birds helped too. Navigators noticed that seabirds followed the same invisible pathways as the currents. Birds flew low along particular lines of water, banking slightly as they reached areas where the current shifted. Watching these birds from a small canoe gave navigators clues about the unseen movement of the sea. When storms approached, the currents felt different. The water grew uneasy. Waves layered themselves strangely. Even paddles dipping into the surface felt heavier, as if the sea held its breath. These signs guided navigators to turn back or seek shelter long before dark clouds appeared. Thus, knowledge of currents became a safety net as much as a travel tool. Over many lifetimes, the understanding deepened. Navigators taught their children not by explaining, but by letting them sit in the stern of the boat, hands trailing in the water, sensing the subtle push and pull beneath their fingers. "Feel how it changes here," a navigator would murmur. "This is the line of the island. The land makes the water remember." The children nodded, though they understood only part of it. Understanding would come later, with time, with calm, with repetition. And so, without written words, without charts, without instruments, early ocean navigators began building the world's first mental maps of moving water. A map that shifted, yet stayed constant. A map that could only be sensed, not seen. A map that turned the ocean from a terrifying unknown into a familiar companion. It was this knowledge, quiet, intuitive, deeply patient, that eventually allowed humanity to leave the sight of land. But not yet. First, they needed one more teacher. The sky. The stars that drew invisible lines. If currents taught navigators how the sea moved, the stars taught them how they were moving. Night after night, generation after generation, people looked upward to a sky that never hurried. Stars drifted in slow patterns, rising in the east, climbing overhead, and sinking gently in the west. Nothing about the stars felt rushed. Their calm movement was perfectly suited for the slow, patient learners that early navigators had become. Most people enjoyed the night sky without studying it. But some lingered longer. Just as some lingered at the shoreline during the day. These were the people who began to recognize meaning in the heavens. At first, they noticed simple things. A bright star rose from the same horizon point on the longest nights of the year. Another rose slightly north of it during warmer seasons. A cluster of tiny stars formed a shape that reminded them of a net. Another cluster resembled a bird with long wings. They did not name constellations the way later cultures did. They named patterns. A pattern that helped them at sea might be called the long path. A pattern visible above a familiar island might be the standing tree. A bright star marking the direction of home might be the returning one. These names mattered less than the feelings they carried, anchor points in an otherwise shifting world. One of the earliest realizations came when navigators noticed that certain constellations rotated around a point in the sky, while others rose and set. The point that did not move, the fixed center of rotation, became a quiet anchor in their imagination. Even without understanding its meaning, they sensed its usefulness. On land, seeing this point gave no particular advantage. At sea, it became essential. Navigators began to travel longer distances between islands, leaving the coastline behind. During these crossings, there came a moment when the boat sat alone under a vast bowl of darkness and stars. In that moment, the sound of waves softened, the horizon blended with the night, and the sky above became the only stable frame of reference. Navigators lay on their backs in their boats and looked up. They began to memorize the rising points of important stars along the horizon. They noticed which stars stayed above them longest. They tracked the movement of groups of stars across the sky, noting how long it took for one pattern to follow another. This was not timekeeping. This was direction finding. One navigator described it this way: when land sleeps, the sky stays awake. Over many years, the navigators discovered that the sky could draw invisible lines across the sea. If a certain star rose near the bow of the boat, the navigator knew the direction of travel. If another star dipped toward the stern, the navigator understood how the boat had drifted. Stars became markers on an enormous, slow-moving compass. But the most profound discovery came when navigators realized that the stars changed with the seasons. The night sky was not a fixed picture. It was a slow-turning wheel, one that revealed a different face in warm months than in cold ones. At first, this confused them. How could the sky change? How could familiar stars vanish? But soon they noticed a pattern. the same stars always returned. This taught navigators something subtle yet powerful. They could use stars to know not only direction, but time of year. In warm months, certain constellations rose early in the evening. In cold months, different constellations appeared first. Thus, stars became seasonal markers as well as navigational ones. Some navigators crafted small wooden plaques, not to depict the stars directly, but to help apprentices remember sequences, one notch for a star rising early in the season, another notch for its position in the middle months, another for when it sank behind the horizon. These wooden aids were not maps. They were memory tools, gentle reminders. Navigation remained entirely mental. Star paths were learned the way songs were learned, through repetition, rhythm, and feeling. A navigator could recite the positions of stars not as data, but as a kind of poem. When the long path touches the horizon, turn toward the wind. When the returning one rises above the mast, you are homeward bound. No symbols. No mathematics. Only memory wrapped in calm observation. Navigators learned to combine this knowledge with the currents. If a star told them which way to point the bow, the current told them how much the sea would push them sideways. The two teachings merged gently, like two soft threads woven into a stronger rope. As distance journeys became more common, the sky became not just a guide, but a companion. Night crossings, once feared, became times of quiet connection. Navigators paddled slowly, the soft splash of the oar accompanied by the shimmering reflections of stars on the water. The horizon dissolved. The boat felt suspended between two vast surfaces, one of water, one of sky. And in that stillness, the world felt less like a boundary, and more like an open space waiting to be understood. The ocean no longer intimidated the early navigators. It humbled them, guided them, and slowly welcomed them into its deeper knowledge. And the stars, steady, patient, returning, became teachers that never left them alone. Stars or currents. The wind. The wind was the first companion of every boat that left the shore and the last companion that guided it home. It arrived without form, moved without shape, but it touched everything: water, skin, trees, sails, the edges of cliffs. And because it touched everything, the early navigators came to understand it intimately. At first, this understanding was humble. Children played near the shore and felt the wind pushing their hair. Fishers paddled into the breeze and noticed how their strokes slowed. Villagers drying nets saw how certain winds made the fibers flutter quickly, while others barely moved them at all. From these small observations came a slow accumulation of knowledge. People noticed that warm wind often came from inland during late afternoon, carrying the scent of earth and plants. Cool winds, arriving near dawn, carried the faint scent of open sea and salt spray. On certain days, wind moved steadily along the coast, and on other days it changed direction with the rising or falling tide. The wind had patterns, subtle but steady. Navigators began by learning the simplest truth. A boat moves differently depending on the wind's direction. When paddling directly into a headwind, forward progress slowed visibly. When traveling with the wind at their back, the boat glided smoothly with much less effort. Crosswinds pushed the craft sideways, sometimes enough that the navigator had to paddle harder on one side to compensate. But as they traveled farther from the safety of land, navigators discovered something deeper. Wind patterns changed with location. On the open ocean, the wind behaved differently than near the shore. Near cliffs, the wind could become unpredictable, swirling downward in sudden gusts. Between islands, winds often squeezed through narrow passages with surprising speed. Over wide, open water, wind adopted a more consistent personality: broad, gentle, steady. Navigators learned to feel these transitions not through sight but through skin, balance, and sound. They noticed how the air pressed differently on the face depending on wind direction. They noticed how waves aligned themselves with prevailing winds. They noticed that the wind's whisper changed pitch depending on whether the boat faced into it or away from it. Many experienced navigators closed their eyes for long stretches of a journey, sensing direction through the wind alone. In darkness, when stars were hidden behind clouds, this ability often saved lives. Wind became a compass that never left their side. Across generations, certain winds earned names, not written names, but spoken ones, used only among navigators. One wind was called the slow puller, for it gently drew boats west during late mornings. Another was known as the hollow wind, because it arrived with a faint, hollow tone that travelers recognized as a sign of approaching rain. A third was the long whisper, a steady inland-to-sea breeze that returned like a familiar melody each season. These winds were not supernatural. They were simply predictable. And predictability is one of the greatest gifts a navigator can receive. Some navigators carried small bundles of feathers tied to the ends of their boats. These feathers quivered in the wind, helping sailors detect even the slightest changes in air movement. Others sprinkled finely ground shells on the surface of the boat. The way the powder drifted across the deck revealed both wind direction and speed. Still others tied thin fibers to their wrists, letting the slightest breeze move through them. No instruments. Only keen senses. But the greatest revelation came when navigators learned to combine wind knowledge with stars and currents. The wind, they realized, followed its own seasonal pattern. In some months, winds came predominantly from the northeast. In other months, they blew from the southwest. These repeating rhythms allowed navigators to plan voyages in harmony with nature. A navigator might wait for a specific wind before attempting a journey between two islands. He might trust that a returning seasonal wind would help carry him home weeks later. In this way, navigation became not only movement across the water, but a conversation with time. Navigators understood something profound. The wind told them when to leave, and the sky told them where they were going. The ocean itself completed the trio, its currents pushing, pulling, shaping each journey with gentleness or difficulty. On long nights at sea, the wind provided comfort. It touched the navigators' cheeks, ruffled their clothing, and filled the quiet space between thoughts. It reminded them that they were not alone, even when land was far away. When storms approached, the first warning was not dark clouds, it was the wind. The air grew heavy or suddenly still. The familiar patterns disappeared. The sea lost its rhythm. Skilled navigators turned their boats back immediately, trusting the wind's message far more than the sky's appearance. And almost always, the wind was right. Thus, wind became a teacher, gentle, invisible, patient. The navigators listened. And through listening, they expanded the boundaries of what humans believed the sea allowed. Experienced paddler. But instead of seeing emptiness, early navigators discovered something quiet and astonishing. The ocean itself contained landmarks. Not landmarks carved into stone or rooted into earth, but floating, drifting, shifting signs that appeared again and again in predictable places. The first of these landmarks were seabirds. Some birds flew great distances over the open water, but they always returned to land before nightfall. Navigators learned to spot the direction from which flocks arrived near evening. If birds flew with purposeful strokes toward a particular horizon, that meant land lay in that direction, no matter how far it might be. A single bird meant little. A flock meant certainty. Navigators also learned to recognize birds that nested on remote islets, places too small to be seen until a traveler was right upon them. These birds offered hints long before the land itself appeared. Then came the drifting vegetation. Long strands of seaweed floated in wide belts across the ocean. These belts formed where currents met or where the sea's movement created natural accumulation zones. Navigators realized that such vegetation often indicated the approach of deeper waters, or the crossing of a major current, or the presence of land many miles ahead. Small twigs and seeds drifting on the water told similar stories. Fresh green leaves could only have come from a nearby landmass. A cluster of flower petals indicated a river outflow. A carved piece of wood hinted at another community far across the sea. These floating objects became quiet messages, never loud, never detailed, but meaningful. Marine life offered additional clues. Schools of fish often traveled along the edges of currents. Large fish followed consistent migratory paths. Sea turtles surfaced in predictable areas during certain months. Navigators observed these movements patiently, year after year, learning to interpret them as road signs. But perhaps the most unexpected floating landmark came from the ocean's own surface. The pattern of waves. Where currents collided, waves formed long, diagonal ridges. Where underwater mountains sat hidden beneath the surface, waves broke slightly differently. Where a distant island rose beyond sight, waves reflected faintly off its unseen shoreline, creating a subtle second pattern that navigators could detect. Experienced navigators described these changes with metaphors rather than numbers. This water has two heartbeats, one would say. Meaning, two wave patterns meeting. The sea here listens, another might murmur. Meaning, the waves were dampened by shallow areas or reefs. To an untrained eye, the ocean looked uniform. To a navigator, it was a landscape made of movement. They could stand in a canoe, close their eyes, and feel how waves lifted the boat. If the lift came from two directions, land lay somewhere ahead. If the waves smoothed suddenly, they approached a current boundary. If the waves grew short and steep, shallow ground lurked below. The ocean whispered these clues constantly, but only to those who listened with patience equal to the sea. Over generations, navigators passed these sensory teachings to their apprentices not through instruction, but through experience. They brought children out in calm weather and had them sit silently, hands trailing in the water, eyes half closed. "What do you feel?" a teacher would ask. "Nothing," the child might reply. "Listen longer," the teacher encouraged. Eventually, sometimes months or years later, the child would begin to sense what had once seemed invisible. The gentle sideways pull. The faint rise beneath the hull. The slight shift of the wind. The different voices of the waves. And in that moment, the ocean stopped being empty. It became something full. Full of signs. Full of structure. Full of quiet meaning. By the time a young navigator made their first long journey beyond the sight of land, they carried with them not fear, but an entire landscape of floating landmarks. None drawn on paper. None carved into wood. All held gently in memory. This memory allowed humanity to cross distances once thought impossible. And yet, the navigators moved through these vast spaces without rush, without urgency, trusting that the world revealed itself slowly, just as the sea revealed its hidden shape through patient attention. Miles, humanity learned the sea through canoes, simple, elegant, quiet shapes carved from single trunks or assembled from bent planks. These canoes were not just tools, they were companions, extensions of the navigators themselves. Each canoe held a personality. Some were heavy and stable, ideal for carrying baskets of fish or bundles of tools. Others were narrow and fast, responding quickly to the smallest paddle stroke. Others were built for journeys between islands, with higher sides to handle unexpected waves. Some had outriggers, long wooden supports attached to one side, to provide balance in rough waters. The earliest navigators understood something profound. A canoe was not a vehicle, it was a way of listening to the sea. When a navigator stepped into their canoe, they immediately felt its mood. A slightly heavier lean meant water had seeped into the hull overnight. A faint vibration meant waves were forming far offshore. A sluggish response to the first paddle stroke meant the current had changed. The canoe communicated constantly, even in stillness. Young apprentices learned this first by sitting inside a canoe on calm mornings. Their teachers instructed them not to paddle, not to move, only to feel. The tiniest shifting of water beneath them carried meaning. After days, then months, then years, these apprentices began to recognize sensations that once seemed meaningless. "It rises differently here," an apprentice might whisper. "Good," the teacher would reply. "The sea floor is changing beneath you." Or, "The canoe turns on its own." "Yes," the teacher murmured. "The wind is speaking." As the apprentices grew more confident, they learned to carve canoes themselves. This was not merely woodworking, it was a form of deep listening. A canoe carved without attention was a canoe that refused to behave well at sea. But a canoe carved with patience, with knowledge of how the grain curved, how the wood breathed, how it balanced, such a canoe moved gently over the water, as if eager to travel. Carving began with selecting the tree. Navigators walked through forests not looking for size alone but for shape. They chose trunks that grew straight but not too fast, so the wood was strong without being brittle. They felt the bark for smoothness. They tapped the trunk and listened to the tone. Low sounds suggested thickness, high sounds suggested hollowness. Only when the tree agreed, as some navigators said quietly, did they begin the work. The process took days or weeks. Wood shavings curled into soft piles around their feet. The hull slowly emerged, first rough, then smoother, then almost polished. When the canoe was finished, the navigator placed it gently into calm water for the first time. They sat in it, paddled once, and waited. How the canoe settled on the water told them everything, whether it was suited for long journeys, for short fishing trips, for travel in strong currents, or for calm lagoons. A well-made canoe required little effort to move. Its balance felt natural. Its bow cut the water softly. Its stern followed without resistance. Navigators described this feeling as the canoe remembering the sea. Over generations, canoe building techniques evolved quietly. Some communities bent planks over heated stones to create curved hulls that rode over waves smoothly. Others used stitched seams made of plant fibers to bind planks together, allowing the canoe to flex gently with the motion of the water. Still others added outriggers, long beams tied to the canoe by curved wooden arms. These outriggers prevented capsizing in large swells, making long-distance travel possible. But even with improved designs, the essential relationship remained the same. The navigator and the canoe were partners. During long journeys between distant islands, the navigator sat in the stern, feeling every ripple through their body. The canoe transmitted information the way a musician senses the vibration of a string, subtle, continuous, essential. A small shift in balance meant a change in current. A faint tremble meant an underwater reef ahead. A quiet roll meant wind was shifting direction. At night, when stars shimmered above and waves glowed faintly with bioluminescent plankton, the canoe became a second skin. Navigators rested one hand in the water, trailing fingers along the surface, while the other hand held the paddle loosely. Their breathing matched the slow rise and fall of the swells. It was in these moments that navigation became not a task but a state of being. Some navigators spoke softly to their canoes, not as a prayer but as acknowledgement. "You have carried me well today. We will turn home soon. Rest now, the water is calm." These were not metaphors. They reflected a real understanding. A canoe that was treated with respect lasted longer, moved better, and remained steady in moments of uncertainty. When storms approached, navigators trusted their canoes deeply. They angled them into the wind at just the right degree, allowing the bow to meet the waves without being overwhelmed. They kept the canoe light, removing unnecessary cargo. They listened to the hull. If it groaned, they adjusted. If it hummed softly, they knew they were safe. Through all this, one truth emerged. The early ocean navigators did not conquer the sea. They cooperated with it. Their canoes reflected that cooperation, simple, quiet vessels shaped not for dominance, but for harmony. And through these humble boats, humanity took its first steady steps across the water, learning that the sea did not require strength to cross it. Only patience, humility, and the willingness to listen. The sky paths. Sky paths were not physical trails. They were not charts or drawings. They were not even stories at first. They were patterns, repeated sequences of stars rising, drifting, and setting in predictable rhythms across the night. Navigators learned these rhythms slowly, through countless nights of simply watching. Children looked up and saw stars. Navigators looked up and saw directions. At first, the sky paths were simple. A bright star that always rose near the direction of a familiar island. A long curved constellation that arched overhead during certain seasons. A cluster that dipped toward the horizon when it was time to return home. But as journeys grew longer, the sky paths grew deeper too. Navigators observed not just where stars rose, but when. Not just their brightness, but their sequence. Not just the patterns of the night sky, but how those patterns shifted with each passing season. A navigator might lie awake in the bottom of a canoe, listening to the water and watching stars drift slowly overhead. Hours would pass. The stars changed position. The night moved. And yet, this movement was slow enough to feel calming, like the turning of a giant wheel that kept the world steady. Over time, navigators memorized these long arcs. They learned that one bright star reached its highest point at midnight during one season, but at dawn in another. They learned that another constellation rose earlier in the year when warm winds arrived and later when the ocean cooled. Through these quiet observations, a truth revealed itself. The sky itself was a calendar and a map combined. A navigator could tell the direction, the season, and even approximate distance traveled simply by watching how the sky paths unfolded. They did not speak of degrees or angles. They spoke of relationships. When the long net rises above the canoe's bow, the island is still far. When the three bright points gather near the horizon, we are halfway. When the crooked bird touches the mast, home waits beyond the next swell. These teachings were passed not through lectures but through experience. An apprentice sat beside the teacher in the canoe, night after night. When the teacher whispered, "Watch now," the apprentice looked up. When the teacher asked, "What do you see?" the apprentice described the sky. Slowly, over months and years, the sky paths became part of their thinking. Repetition was the essence of learning. A sky path seen once meant nothing. A sky path seen 100 times became the foundation of navigation. Navigators often stayed awake long after the rest of the crew slept, simply observing how the sky turned. They learned to anticipate when a star would emerge from behind thin clouds. They sensed the slight darkening of the sky before moonrise. They noticed the faint brightening that preceded dawn, long before any color appeared. As they traveled farther from familiar coasts, sky paths became even more essential. Currents changed. Wind shifted. Waves became inconsistent. But the stars remained steady. Even on the largest oceans, even in vast spaces where land remained unseen for days, the sky paths never abandoned the navigators. A navigator in the middle of an enormous sea could look up and say, calmly, "We are still on the path. The sky has not changed." And in that confidence, the canoe continued forward. But the sky paths taught something more profound than direction. They taught patience. Stars moved slowly, so navigators learned to think slowly. Stars repeated their cycles, so navigators learned to trust repetition. Stars changed slightly each season, so navigators learned that change was natural, not alarming. This mindset shaped entire cultures. Villagers who never left their home island learned through stories that the sky moved with dependable rhythm. Children learned that the world did not shift unpredictably. Elders taught that nothing important ever happened suddenly. It all unfolded quietly, gradually, with the same calmness that filled the night sky. Sky paths were not only for distant journeys. They brought comfort to everyone. In the soft hours before dawn, when stars began to fade and the horizon brightened, early navigators felt a deep truth settle into them. The sea had currents. The wind had moods. The waves had voices. The canoe had memory. But the sky? The sky had order. And through that order, humanity learned how to travel farther than anyone had once imagined possible. Unified awareness. This understanding came not from the sea itself, nor from the sky, but from the places in between. The islands that revealed themselves long before they came into view. For a long time, humans believed that land appeared suddenly from the horizon, a distant dark shape rising from the curve of the earth, unmistakable once it showed itself. But as navigators ventured farther across open waters, they discovered that islands announced themselves far earlier, in dozens of quiet, almost invisible ways. The first sign was the swell pattern. Far from land, swells moved in long, consistent rhythms. They rose and fell with patient regularity, unaffected by the presence of shores or reefs. But as a canoe approached the influence of an island, even one still invisible beyond the horizon, the ocean changed. The long, even swell fractured. Another swell pattern, coming softly from a different direction, appeared. Then, sometimes, a faint third pattern. Navigators learned that this mixture of swells meant one thing. Land was ahead. Its unseen shoreline reflecting waves back into the open sea. To an untrained traveler, the ocean still looked smooth. But to a navigator sitting low in a canoe, feet stretched forward, fingertips trailing in the water, the shift was unmistakable. An elder navigator described it like this. An island speaks with three voices before your eyes hear its shape. The second sign was the birds. Some seabirds circled vast distances from shore, but even these birds behaved differently when land was near. Navigators watched how birds fed, how high they flew, whether they carried fish, whether they returned to their nests before sunset. A bird carrying food flew with heavier wing beats and traveled in straighter lines. These lines almost always pointed toward land. One bird meant little. Two birds flying in the same direction meant something. A gathering of birds moving with intention meant certainty. On long voyages, navigators often watched the horizon not for land, but for birds. A single white shape drifting across the sky brought comfort. It meant they were connected to something solid, even if their eyes still saw only water. The third sign lay in the floating life of the ocean. For days at sea, the water might carry only small bits of driftwood, tiny jellyfish, scattered pieces of seaweed. But as the canoe neared an island, the material changed. Brown leaves from inland trees. Flower petals. Seeds still green with moisture. Sometimes even insects, ants, beetles, small spiders clinging to splinters of bark. These objects were too fresh to have traveled far. Navigators scooped them from the water, examined them quietly, and nodded. Land breathes this way, they would say. The fourth sign came from the color of the ocean itself. Deep water far from land was dark, almost indigo at noon, nearly black at dusk. As navigators approached an island, the color shifted gradually. The water grew lighter, clearer, more green than blue. Sunlight reflected differently. Shadows beneath the boat became more defined. This color change was subtle, unfolding across many hours, sometimes across entire days. But navigators saw it the way farmers saw the first hint of a changing season. Shallow water meant reefs. Reefs meant fish. Fish meant land. The fifth sign was clouds. Land influenced the air. The air influenced the sky. Above large islands, clouds tended to gather. Moisture rising from forests created tall, soft formations, pale at morning, glowing at evening, sometimes lingering long after the horizon seemed empty. Navigators recognized these cloud shapes instantly. Island clouds, they called them. An island cloud could be seen long before the land itself, standing still in a sky where all other clouds drifted gently. This stillness was a clue as powerful as any star. But perhaps the most beautiful sign of all was the fragrance of land. After many days at sea, far from vegetation or soil, the nose grew accustomed to salt, water, and wind. Then, one morning, often just before sunrise, a faint sweetness drifted across the ocean, a scent of earth, leaves, flowers, damp bark. Navigators sat still when they smelled it. They breathed deeply, letting the faint aroma settle into memory. Land is close, they whispered. Not far now. This scent, more than any other sign, brought an immense sense of calm. It meant the voyage had succeeded. It meant the sea had accepted them. It meant shelter, fire, and fresh water lay somewhere ahead. Thus, long before they saw land with their eyes, navigators saw land with their senses. The island already existed in their awareness, in the shifting waves, the gathering birds, the softening color, the scent on the wind. By the time the silhouette of palm trees or cliffs rose from the horizon, the navigators were not surprised. They were simply witnessing the final stage of a process the ocean had begun whispering hours or even days earlier. This ability to know land without seeing it became one of the greatest skills of early navigators. It allowed them to cross spaces wider than sight. It allowed them to trust in clues that most humans ignored. It allowed them to chart routes that no one had yet walked upon a map. The islands taught them to listen. And by listening, they learned to travel farther than the world once believed possible. The ocean did not reward haste. It did not answer urgent questions. It revealed itself slowly, through cycles, rhythms, and repeated patterns. Those who rushed misunderstood the sea. Those who waited learned from it. Patience began on land, long before a voyage. Navigators waited weeks, sometimes months, for the right winds. They waited for calmer currents. They waited for moonlight, or for darkness, depending on what the journey required. A voyage began only when sky, sea, and season aligned. If not, they simply did not depart. This was not hesitation. It was wisdom. Once at sea, patience became even more essential. Travel was not fast. Hours passed with the canoe barely gaining distance. Night stretched long, with only the stars for company. Days drifted in warm silence, broken only by paddles touching water. But navigators did not feel trapped by time. They traveled inside time, moving at the pace the world allowed. When clouds hid the stars, they waited. When currents resisted progress, they rested. When the wind changed, they adjusted direction gently, without frustration. They trusted that each obstacle was temporary. The sky always cleared eventually. The currents always shifted again. the wind always returned to its familiar patterns. Patience guided their decision-making. A navigator approaching unknown waters might stop paddling entirely and simply float, watching how the canoe drifted, how the swell changed, how the birds behaved. These moments of stillness contained more information than any movement. To a modern observer, the navigator might look inactive. But in truth, they were performing one of the most important parts of the journey. They were letting the world speak. Patience also shaped how navigators taught their apprentices. A lesson was never a command. It was an invitation. "Watch the waves tonight," a teacher might say. The apprentice would ask, "What do you want me to see?" The teacher would reply, "Watch for many nights, then you will know." Knowledge arrived slowly, often unexpectedly, after long periods of observation. Apprentices learned that understanding could not be forced. It appeared only when the mind had become quiet enough to receive it. Patience turned confusion into clarity. Navigators also showed patience with themselves. A mistake on the water was not a failure, it was information. A failed attempt to find an island was not an error, it was experience. They knew that mastery required years of drifting along coasts, reading the sky, learning the moods of the sea, memorizing the voices of wind and waves. No one became a navigator quickly. Patience, in this sense, was a form of humility. It reminded navigators that they were small in the face of the ocean, but also that smallness was not weakness. It was simply the beginning of learning. Finally, patience shaped how the navigators understood the world. They saw that stars returned, winds repeated, currents circled, clouds reformed, islands spoke in advance, and the sea never acted without cause. Through this repeating order, they came to believe that the ocean was not chaotic. It was calm, deliberate, predictable, even generous to those who approached it with the same qualities. And so, patience was not just a virtue. It was the very engine of early navigation. Without it, the first long ocean crossings would never have happened. With it, humanity slowly stretched its reach across the water, moving quietly, gently, confidently, from one horizon to the next. The winds, currents, swells, and the faint signs of distant islands, they faced another truth, one that rested not on any physical landmark, nor on birds or drifting leaves, but on the quiet certainty of the sky's long memory. Every night, the sky repeated its vast slow turning. Not the quick turning that carried stars from east to west over a single evening, but the seasonal turning, the long, patient shift that revealed itself only across months. Navigators learned this shift slowly. At first, it was only a feeling. A star that once rose early in the evening began rising later. A constellation that once appeared overhead at midnight drifted westward. A familiar cluster dimmed slightly as humid nights approached. These changes did not alarm navigators. Instead, they reassured them. Because these shifts proved something profound. The sky always remembered its place. It returned to the same patterns every year. This long memory became another form of navigation, so gentle, so subtle, that only those who traveled often enough noticed. Navigators observed the sky across entire seasons, not nights. On long ocean journeys, nights stretched into days, and days into weeks. At sea, without mountains or forests or tall trees to mark the seasons, it was the sky that whispered the passage of time. When a navigator saw the net of stars, a cluster known differently from place to place, rising before dawn, they knew the season was shifting toward cooler winds. When the crooked canoe appeared overhead shortly after sunset, they felt in their bones that the warm months had arrived. When a bright star in the southern sky rose higher than the last voyage, they understood that the year had turned again. Because of these observations, even long journeys that lasted many weeks felt anchored. A navigator could look up and think, "We travel not through emptiness, but along a path the sky keeps for us." This connection between voyage and season created a mental map that extended far beyond the horizon. Some navigators believed the sky could pull them toward land, not literally, but psychologically. If certain constellations appeared in a particular orientation, navigators sensed they were closer to specific islands. For example, when the long, curved constellation tilted toward the northwest, they felt they were nearing an island known for its high cliffs. When the same constellation tilted differently, they sensed they had drifted too far south. These were not rigid rules. They were gentle hints remembered through repetition. The canoe, the sea, and the sky formed a triad, a patient conversation that shaped every journey. No navigator relied on a single sign. They watched the stars, felt the current, listened to the wind, and rested their palms on the canoe's wooden ribs, feeling the faintest shiver of water beneath them. This layered approach made long-distance travel possible even before written charts existed. But the greatest turning point came when navigators began linking journeys together. Not just one trip between two islands, but series of journeys that revealed the shape of an entire ocean. One navigator described it as learning the long breath of the sea. A short breath was a single crossing, a journey of a day or two. A long breath stretched across islands separated by hundreds of miles. Navigators memorized these long breaths slowly. They knew that the warm season winds carried them in one direction, and the cool season winds carried them home. They knew that particular birds migrated in loops across vast water, returning every year at the same time. They knew that certain stars, once low on the horizon, climbed higher as the months passed, signaling when voyages should lengthen or shorten. All of this created a sense of rhythm so natural that navigation became less about finding the way and more about following a path that the world had already laid out. One elder navigator put it simply, "The sea forgets, but the sky remembers." And so, early seafarers trusted the sky's memory to guide them through distances once thought impossible. For example, a shift in the canoe's creaking meant the swell had changed direction. A faint tapping from underneath meant a school of fish was passing. Fish known to swim near shallow regions. A distant, hollow sound carried over water meant land was reflecting ocean noise, even if the shore remained unseen. Sound became an invisible map. Navigators trained themselves to hear differences that others ignored. They knew the hush of deep water, the rumble of distant reefs, the smooth whisper of calm seas, the muttered churning of crossing currents. On still nights, when the sky stretched wide and clear, the silence felt enormous. A soft dome encasing the travelers as they drifted along currents they barely felt. The silence was not emptiness. It was presence. It allowed navigators to sense the world without distraction. They listened to the soft brushing of the wind across the bow, the silent change when clouds covered stars, the unique rustle of palm leaves when land lay beyond the dark horizon, the faint calls of seabirds hunting at night. They even listened to their own breath, slowing it to match the rhythm of the sea, calming thoughts so the world could speak more clearly. In silence, teachings arrived. Some of the most experienced navigators said that silence opened the ocean. This did not mean that the sea became physically different. Rather, in silence, the mind grew spacious enough to perceive subtle signs. Many navigators traveled for hours without speaking, communicating through eye movements, small gestures, or the angle of their paddles. When they needed to share knowledge, they whispered. Soft words carried across the canoe like part of the wind. Do you feel the swell changing? There is a second rhythm now. Birds behind us, land ahead soon. Silence also shaped how navigators rested. They slept in short intervals, trusting companions to keep watch. The sound of the sea woke them instantly if anything changed. The slap of a higher wave, the calm of sudden slack water, the whisper of stronger winds. In moments of uncertainty, silence helped them recover direction. A navigator might close their eyes for several breaths, listening, feeling, sensing. Then quietly adjust the canoe's angle by a fraction. No panic. No urgency. Just careful attention. This calm approach allowed them to travel incredible distances without losing their way. The greatest voyages, those spanning hundreds of miles, depended entirely on silence. In silence, navigators did not feel alone. They felt accompanied by the sea, supported by the wind, guided by the stars, and connected to every navigator who had traveled before them. Silence turned the ocean from a threat into a teacher. It transformed long nights into meditative journeys. It allowed navigators to think clearly, move slowly, and trust deeply. Journeys succeeded not through force or speed, but through patience, listening, and the quiet understanding that the world offered more guidance than anyone could ever ask for. As long as one moved slowly enough to hear it, carried their world not in objects but in memory. This memory was not a single idea kept inside the mind, rather, it was a long woven thread, thin in some places, strong in others, built slowly, patiently, through years of traveling the same waters in different seasons, under different skies. This memory thread connected everything. The swell beneath the canoe, the wind brushing across the cheeks, the birds that circled at dusk, the stars that rose with familiar timing, the distant scent of leaves drifting out from unseen land. Navigators did not memorize facts. They memorized relationships. How one feeling echoed another. How a shift in the wind meant a shift in current. How a certain cloud above the horizon meant land. And how a certain pattern of birds meant deep water ahead. The mind of a navigator became a quiet archive. When a canoe crossed a place where currents changed direction, that sensation entered the memory thread. When a particular star rose during a voyage home, that moment tied another knot in the thread. When a wave reflected strangely, subtle, gentle, barely visible, navigators stored that information in the same mental space that held the songs of their ancestors. Some navigators described their memory like a woven mat, a wide surface where each sign from the sea lay beside another, forming a pattern. Others imagined memory as a long necklace of shells, each shell representing a landmark, a season, a wind, a star, a piece of information gathered and strung quietly over many years. But the most common metaphor was the thread. Thin yet enduring, flexible yet reliable. Training apprentices in this memory was not simple. A teacher could not simply tell something and expect understanding. Memory had to be built through experience. So the apprentices sat in the bow of the canoe, facing the direction of travel, letting the world touch them gently. Teachers rarely instructed directly. Instead, they would murmur things like, "Remember this feeling," or "Watch how the swell changes after the next hour," or "Tonight, do not sleep. The sky will teach." This meant memory was not gathered in sudden moments of clarity but formed slowly, like sand settling on the ocean floor, one grain at a time, until a solid layer emerged. The memory thread grew longer with each repetition of a journey. Traveling the same path in a different season changed the thread slightly. Seeing a familiar constellation under a different moonlight altered the thread again. Hearing the sound of waves break against a reef they had encountered months earlier added yet another layer. Over many years, these layers created a navigational skill so deep that even an experienced navigator could not fully explain how they knew the way. They simply felt it. Some nights, when waves glowed faintly with bioluminescence and stars shimmered across the dark bowl of the sky, navigators closed their eyes and let the canoe drift. They felt the thread tighten, like a soft pull, guiding them in a particular direction. Perhaps it was the memory of a swell pattern they had felt before. Perhaps it was the faint scent of land. Perhaps it was the subtle change in temperature that hinted at nearby shallows. None of this could be written, but all of it was known. This interwoven memory allowed navigators to create mental maps far larger than any one journey. They could describe a sequence of islands stretching across hundreds of miles. They knew which islands lay north of the warm winds and which lay south of the turning currents. They knew where storms gathered, where winds strengthened at dawn, where birds departed in early evenings. To a modern mind, this seems extraordinary, almost impossible. But to early navigators, it was simply a natural result of patience. Even memory was approached slowly, calmly, without pressure. Mistakes were not failures, they were additional threads. If a navigator drifted off course, that path became part of the memory thread. The next time, they recognized the signs earlier and corrected sooner. Over time, memory grew strong not because navigators avoided errors, but because they accepted them. And so, through the woven memory thread, entire generations learned to travel across oceans without writing a single word, drawing a single line, or carving a single symbol. The ocean taught. The sky affirmed. The canoe remembered. And the navigator listened. This is how knowledge moved across centuries, quietly, gently, held in the minds of those who crossed the water with humility. Early navigators did not wake up one morning and decide to paddle into the unknown. Instead, several small realizations accumulated. Islands could be sensed before they were seen. Stars repeated their cycles with dependable rhythm. Winds changed direction with the seasons, providing natural lanes of travel. Currents flowed predictably in long, sweeping arcs across the sea. And most importantly, the ocean revealed itself to those who moved slowly enough to notice. This understanding allowed navigators to attempt longer voyages, ones that lasted many days, then many weeks. These journeys were not taken for glory or exploration. They were taken for practical reasons, to find new fishing waters, to trade tools or food, to visit kin across distant islands. Long crossings did not begin with confidence. They began with patience. Navigators waited for a particular wind, one they trusted deeply. They prepared canoes carefully, reinforcing joints, smoothing hulls, tying bundles of dried food wrapped in leaves. They checked the sky at dusk and dawn for subtle signs, the tilt of a constellation, the color of clouds over distant horizons. Then, when the world aligned, they pushed the canoe into the water, not with excitement, but with quiet readiness. The first night of a long crossing always felt familiar. Stars shone overhead. Currents moved gently. The canoe rocked with a comfortable rhythm. But as land faded behind them, the mind changed. Not with fear, fear belonged to those who rushed, but with a deeper awareness. Navigators became more alert to everything. The angle of the wind, the pattern of the swell, the silence between waves, the movement of birds at dawn. By the second or third day, when no land had been visible for many hours, a stillness settled across the voyage. This was not the stillness of calm water, it was the stillness of the mind accepting the vastness of the sea. To keep direction, navigators relied on the sky's memory. To keep hope, they relied on the ocean's patterns. To keep balance, they relied on their canoes. Fear visited only those who forgot that the world had been guiding them all along. Some nights during long crossings, the ocean turned dark and quiet. Wind softened until they could no longer be felt. In these moments, navigators rested their paddles and listened to the deep silence. They waited, not impatiently, not anxiously, but the way one waits for the next breath. When the wind returned, it felt like a friend. Navigators did not measure progress by distance. They measured it by signs. A swell shifting slightly, meaning they had crossed into a new current. Birds unseen for days suddenly appearing, meaning land lay within reach of the next horizon. Cloud formations gathering in stillness, meaning an island exerted its gentle pull on the sky. The faintest scent of earth rising before sunrise, meaning their journey was nearing its end. These signs replaced fear with calm certainty. When, at last, the dark outline of land rose from the horizon, the navigators did not cheer. They simply nodded, acknowledging that the world had kept its promises. Landfall was not the climax of the journey. The journey itself, the long patience, the gentle attentiveness, the trust in subtle patterns, was the heart of the story. Long crossings became common over generations, and as they did, navigators learned something profound. The sea was not an obstacle. It was a bridge. A slow, wide, rhythmic bridge connecting places, people, memories, and knowledge across immense distances. And those who crossed it learned that the bridge was safest not for the bold or the strong, but for the calm, the observant, and the deeply patient. Thus, the fear of open ocean dissolved gradually from human culture, replaced by a kind of serene respect. The sea was vast, yes, but it was understandable. It spoke to those who listened. It revealed itself to those who moved quietly. And so, the first major crossings of the ancient ocean were not heroic feats. They were gentle conversations between humans and the world around them, conversations carried across waves, across stars, across wind lines, and across memory threads. Through these conversations, humanity discovered not only new islands, but a new relationship with the sea. One built entirely on trust, attentiveness, and the steady calm that allows the impossible to become simply another path. The invisible distances between islands. There came a time in the history of early navigation when people began to understand something subtle, a truth that did not sit on the surface of the sea, nor in the stars, nor in the wind alone, but in the spaces between journeys. These spaces were not measured in miles, not counted in days, not marked by sunrise or sunset. They were instead measured in feeling, a quiet, gentle awareness navigators developed after thousands of hours on the water. Navigators learned that the distance between islands was not merely physical. It was also sensory, rhythmic, and atmospheric. Two islands might be separated by many miles of water, yet feel close because the currents between them flowed steadily, or because clouds above them formed in recognizable shapes, or because birds traveled along that route in great numbers. Meanwhile, two islands of similar physical distance might feel much farther apart if the ocean between them lacked familiar signs or if the wind behaved unpredictably. Thus, the concept of distance became fluid. Navigators began to describe islands not by how far they were, but by how many changes occurred in the world between them. An elder navigator might say, "That island is 2 wind changes to the east," meaning the direction of the breeze typically shifted twice during the journey. Another might say, "It is a night and a half of the long swell," meaning the canoe would ride through one full cycle of major ocean patterns, then half of another. Others describe distance through birds. Travel until the frigate birds disappear, and continue until the terns begin to gather. Still others use the sky. When the crooked constellation begins to tilt downward, you will be near the halfway point. These descriptions were not vague, they were deeply precise within the navigator's way of knowing. They captured an understanding that water did not exist as empty space. Instead, it held its own landmarks, fluid, rhythmic, constantly moving yet reliably patterned. Over time, navigators developed an internal map of these invisible distances. Not drawn, not carved, not spoken in formal lessons, but felt. Apprentices learn to perceive these distances through repeated exposure. On a long journey, the teacher might instruct, "Close your eyes. Listen to the canoe. Tell me when the swell changes." The apprentice sat still, breathing slowly, hands resting gently on the canoe's wooden ribs. After a long while, not minutes, but often an hour or more, the apprentice might whisper, "It has changed now." "Good," the teacher would reply. "We have entered the second distance." Such teachings could not be rushed. They unfolded at the pace of waves. Navigators learned to sense invisible thresholds, subtle shifts in sea behavior that marked transitions between one region of ocean and another. These transitions might feel like small changes in the canoe's roll, or a slight difference in the wind's texture, or a softening or sharpening of the swell rhythm. To an inexperienced traveler, they were nothing. To a navigator, they were precise, unmistakable markers. Some distances were defined by sound. A region of the sea might carry a faint humming resonance created by distant reefs, barely audible but present to trained ears. Another region might be marked by the absence of such resonance, creating a feeling of deep, open quiet. Some distances were defined by currents. Navigators could sense the shift from one current to another by the way the canoe drifted during rest. A slow sideways pull indicated a transition. A stillness indicated another. These transitions often aligned with the boundaries between islands, even when land remained far beyond sight. But the most remarkable aspect of these invisible distances was how they allowed navigators to predict land. A navigator could sit in complete darkness, with no stars visible, no wind stirring, no birds calling, and simply feel the ocean's texture shift gracefully from one region into another. After enough such shifts, they would murmur, "We are close now." Not because they saw anything, not because they heard anything, but because the sea told them. A father taught a child. A seasoned navigator taught an apprentice. And each new generation drifted farther from the islands they called home, not because they sought adventure, but because their understanding of the sea naturally widened. As this happened, something subtle occurred. The known world expanded without anyone noticing the exact moment when it grew. At first, a community might know only its home island and the next one visible on the horizon. Over time, as navigators shared quiet knowledge, those horizons blended into broader regions. And even farther beyond, unseen islands were understood through the stories of currents and birds and clouds, long before they ever appeared in view. Eventually, entire archipelagos became connected by invisible pathways of understanding. But this growth was never declared. No one stood on a shore and announced that the world had grown larger. Instead, people simply paddled where their ancestors had not paddled, guided by the same patterns of stars, swells, clouds, and winds. The growth felt natural, almost inevitable. One of the reasons expansion happened so gently was the navigators' relationship with time. They did not rush. They did not treat journeys as conquests. They did not measure achievement by how quickly a new island was reached. A journey took as long as the world required. If the wind suggested waiting, they waited. If the current slowed, they drifted. If the stars hid behind clouds, they rested. If birds behaved strangely, they paused and watched. Through this slow rhythm, voyages unfolded like long breaths. Even a crossing lasting many days felt serene, unhurried. The canoe was not forced forward, it simply moved in cooperation with the world. As navigators reached new islands, they observed without judgment. They studied the shape of the coastline, the direction of the prevailing winds, the slope of beaches, the presence of reefs. They noted which birds gathered at dusk and which left at dawn. They tasted the water from streams, smelled the leaves of trees, listened to the sound of waves breaking on rock. All of this quietly entered their memory thread. Returning home, they did not speak dramatically of discovery. Instead, they described small things. The winds there are gentle in the morning. The swell shifts twice before you reach the reef. The clouds gather above the ridge before evening. The birds fly low when storms are far and high when storms are near. Such details slowly reshape the mental map held collectively by their people. The expansion of the world also brought something else: a deeper sense of connection. Navigators began to realize that the ocean did not separate islands. It connected them. The same stars shone over every island they visited. The same winds shifted with the same cycles. The same currents looped through the same regions. The same birds followed their timeless paths. And because these patterns repeated, the ocean began to feel less like a vast unknown and more like a familiar home, wide, yes, but consistent. In time, the navigators could sit in the center of a great stretch of water, with no land in sight in any direction, and still feel anchored. Anchored by the sky. Anchored by the swell. Anchored by birds and cloud shapes and faint scents on the breeze. They understood that the world had no edges, not truly. Where one island's influence faded, another began. Where one current ended, another took its place. Where the memory of a journey waned, a new memory emerged. And so, the navigator's world expanded not through conquest, but through listening. Not through force, but through attentiveness. Not through rushing into the unknown, but through allowing the unknown to reveal itself slowly. No one knew how large the world truly was. But navigators understood something more important. The world was far larger than fear, and far smaller than patience. It expanded at the pace of observation and contracted at the pace of trust. And because they trusted deeply, the known world grew beautifully, quietly, steadily. One horizon at a time. The patterns that revealed the shape of the ocean. There came a stage in the evolution of early navigation when the ocean stopped feeling like a series of separate journeys and instead began to feel like a single, continuous landscape, vast, quiet, and shaped by patterns that stretched farther than any island chain. Navigators did not suddenly decide this. The idea arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly, across many generations of quiet observation. At first, people believed each island existed in its own isolated space. One island had certain winds, another had different currents, another had distinct bird paths. But with time, navigators began to notice something subtle. Although each island had its own character, the world around them behaved in connected ways. Winds shifted across wide arcs. Currents looped in long, gentle circles. Bird migrations followed enormous loops. And the sky above each island rotated with the same quiet patience. Little by little, navigators realized they were not traveling through random conditions. They were traveling through a single, unified system. Recognizing this system required a tremendous amount of time, not measured in days or weeks, but in years and decades. Navigators needed to paddle the same routes dozens of times, in different seasons, under different skies, in both calm and restless seas. They needed to feel the slight changes in swell patterns along long distances, to notice how the wind changed texture at the same points in every journey, to sense how scent and humidity shifted in predictable ways. These insights did not arrive with excitement. They arrived with calm certainty. A navigator might say, when the swell becomes broader and the wind softens, the long current lies ahead, even if land was nowhere to be seen. Another might remark, this is the turning water, describing a place where two ocean regions met. These small statements, passed from one generation to the next, created a growing awareness of the ocean as something that had shape, not physical shape, but behavioral shape. One of the greatest realizations came through the study of distant storms. Navigators noticed that long before a storm could be seen, the swell changed. Waves grew rounder and slower, not harsher, but deeper. The ocean began to breathe differently. Even the canoe took on a different rhythm, rising and falling with a sense of heaviness that told travelers something large was happening far away. This realization, that distant events shaped nearby waters, was profound. It meant the ocean carried information across vast distances. Every swell was a messenger. Every shift in the sea surface carried news from horizons unseen. Thus, navigators began to understand the ocean as a vast field of signals, constant, gentle, slow-moving, yet utterly reliable. When a community decided to explore beyond familiar routes, they did not do so blindly. They trusted these signals. They trusted the currents that seemed to invite them outward, the winds that aligned softly with the arc of the sky, the clouds that gathered in ways that hinted at distant land. They paddled into what others might call emptiness, but to them, it felt like following a weak but steady path. There were moments on long journeys when the ocean felt too open, too broad, too uniform. But even then, navigators looked for patterns that revealed structure. They watched for the faintest shine on the surface, tiny ripples created by wind lines. They studied bird behavior not only during the day but at dusk, when birds flew with more intention. They dipped their hands into the water to feel temperature changes. Warm water might indicate shallow regions, while cool water meant deep currents. They also listened. Sound carried differently in different waters. Some regions had a soft, muffled tone. Others carried distant echoes. Some had a low, humming resonance created by unseen reefs. Navigators memorized these sounds the way others memorized songs. With time, these experiences created an internal sense of the ocean structure, a kind of quiet mental geography. Navigators did not visualize the ocean the way modern maps do, with precise outlines and distances. Instead, they remembered how the sea felt in different regions, how the sky looked, how the wind behaved, how the canoe responded. This internal sense allowed them to travel through immense distances without ever feeling lost. Loss required disorientation. But navigators were never disoriented. They understood that even when the ocean felt empty, it was full of information. One navigator famously said, "You are lost only if you forget to listen." This principle guided early seafarers across waters far larger than any land they knew. They did not push outward with ambition. They expanded their world gently, slowly, letting the sea reveal itself inch by inch, wave by wave, night by night. And as their understanding deepened, the ocean transformed from a mysterious expanse into a familiar presence, complex, yes, but trustworthy, predictable, patient. The ocean had shape. The ocean had mood. The ocean had memory. And the navigators learned all of it, quietly, without maps, without urgency, without conquest, through the gentle accumulation of attention. How could such subtle knowledge be passed from one generation to the next? Books did not exist. Symbols were not used to record direction. Charts were not drawn. Everything depended on memory, repetition, and deeply attentive teaching. The wisdom of navigation was not transferred through lectures. It was transferred through presence. When a child expressed curiosity about the sea, elders watched closely. If the curiosity persisted, across months, across seasons, the child was invited to sit in the bow of the canoe during short trips. Nothing was explained at first. The child learned by being in the environment, feeling how the canoe moved, noticing how the wind touched the cheeks differently depending on direction, listening to the sound of the sea under different skies. Only after long exposure did teaching begin. A teacher would point to the horizon and say something simple. "Do you see how the clouds hold their shape there?" Or, "Tonight, remember where that bright star rises." These were not instructions to memorize facts. They were invitations to notice patterns. Teaching proceeded slowly, at the pace of the world itself. No one rushed. No one expected mastery quickly. In fact, becoming a navigator could take decades. Children first learned to sense the sea's basic moods. Teenagers learned how to interpret wind and swell patterns. Adults memorized sky paths across seasons. Elders developed an intuitive sense for invisible distances and distant land. By the time a navigator reached old age, their mind held a vast quiet knowledge, layers upon layers of observations, repeated across thousands of hours at sea. Elders were not merely instructors, they were repositories of accumulated human experience. Their teachings were gentle, often delivered without drama. An elder might paddle in silence for hours before offering a single sentence. This is the water that curves around the southern islands. Or, we have reached the place where the warm wind begins. These sentences, simple on the surface, represented decades of knowledge. To ensure the continuity of this wisdom, apprentices traveled with elders on countless voyages. They watched the way elders angled their paddles, the way they adjusted their sitting posture when the swell shifted, the way they paused before making a decision. Every gesture held meaning. One of the most striking aspects of this system was how little emphasis elders placed on themselves. They did not claim ownership over knowledge. They did not treat navigation as a skill to protect. Instead, they saw themselves as temporary carriers of wisdom that began before them and would continue after them. They often said, "This knowledge belongs to the sea." It was a way of acknowledging that they were learning from something far older than any person, something that had shaped itself across centuries of tides, winds, and stars. The wisdom passed across generations included 3 essential teachings. 1. The world is patient. Navigators learned that the sea revealed everything at the right time. There was no need to force understanding. 2. The world is connected. Changes in the sky reflected changes in the sea. Birds responded to currents. Clouds responded to land. Nothing existed alone. 3. The world rewards attention. Ignoring small signs meant missing essential truths. But those who watched closely always found the information they needed. Through these teachings, navigation became more than a practical skill. It became a philosophy, one that shaped how communities lived, traveled, and understood themselves. People learned to move through the world slowly, without haste, trusting subtlety over force. They learned to observe deeply, listen quietly, and act with calm consideration. They learned that knowledge did not come from commanding the world, but from cooperating with it. This quiet philosophy shaped entire cultures around the sea. When elders passed away, their apprentices continued their voyages, carrying the memory thread forward. New generations added their own understanding, deepened existing knowledge, refined techniques, and extended the boundaries of the known world even farther. But the tone of wisdom never changed. Gentle, patient, calm, attentive, endlessly observant. The sea remained the great teacher, and navigators remained its devoted students. Navigation became commonplace. A quiet shift occurred in the way navigators thought about the sea. The ocean was no longer simply a pathway between islands. It was no longer a test of skill or memory. It was no longer a place to cross. Instead, the ocean became understood as something deeper and far more enduring. A library of patient knowledge. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly, through countless voyages, subtle observations, gentle corrections, and quiet reflections made while drifting under stars. Navigators began to sense that the sea was not random, not chaotic, not empty. Everything the ocean did, every shift, every swell, every change in color or sound, was part of a long conversation between water, wind, sky, land, and time. Navigators learned to read the ocean the way others read stories. A faint line on the water wrote a sentence about wind changing over far horizons. A soft cross pattern in the swell whispered of underwater mountains. A sudden gathering of birds drew an invisible map of currents carrying small fish. A patch of unusually warm water told of distant shallows rising beneath the surface. A gentle throb in the hull signaled the presence of a new current band. A shift in cloud shape revealed the quiet influence of an unseen island. Little by little, these signs formed a layered text. Elders often said the ocean spoke in pages that turned slowly with seasons, with tides, with the positions of stars. To them, each voyage was a reading session in an endless book. One could never finish the book, nor hope to master it. But one could always read more, always understand a little deeper, always notice something subtle that had been overlooked before. In this sense, navigation became a form of literacy. Just as literacy on land required years of practice, navigation required decades of patient attention. The ocean rewarded this patience by offering clearer and clearer information. The more a navigator watched, the more they understood. The more they understood, the farther they could travel. And the farther they traveled, the more they saw how everything was connected. The sky, especially, became part of this library. Stars, once viewed simply as lights, transformed into markers of repeating cycles, a kind of celestial script moving across vast darkness. Constellations were not illustrations but paragraphs describing seasonal winds. The rising of certain stars provided clues about currents. The setting of others hinted at weather far ahead. Navigators read the sky in parallel with the sea. They read the waves like lines of text, and the stars like headings. They read wind as tone. They read birds as footnotes. They read clouds as commentary from distant islands. By combining these readings, navigators created mental maps far more complex than any physical chart could ever represent. These mental maps were not static. They evolved with each voyage. A new detail might refine an existing memory. A shift in weather patterns might add nuance. Changes in fish migrations might reveal hidden eddies or deeper ocean changes. In this way, knowledge expanded steadily. Not explosively, not dramatically, but quietly, like the slow rising of tide. Apprentices learned early that they were not memorizing instructions, they were learning a language spoken by water and wind. Elders guided them not by giving answers, but by inviting questions. An apprentice might feel confused or uncertain, and the elder would simply say, "Listen longer." For in the library of the sea, information rarely came quickly. It came softly, over time, through repetition. This quiet pace shaped the character of navigators. They became calm thinkers, slow to judge, slow to act, slow to claim certainty, because they understood the world itself moved slowly and gently. The sea revealed itself not to those who demanded answers, but to those who waited, still, attentive, patient. One of the most important insights came when navigators realized that the ocean behaved differently in different chapters. These chapters were not defined by location alone, but by season, by sky, by the patterns of migration, by distant storms, by the subtle geographies beneath the surface. A stretch of ocean familiar in 1 month might feel entirely different in another, not because the navigator changed, but because the page of the sea had turned. Elders taught apprentices to treat each chapter with humility. A familiar route in early summer might require new understanding in late autumn. A pathway guided by one constellation might vanish when cloud cover thickened. A gentle current might become difficult when distant storms disrupted its flow. The sea was a library, but the pages were alive. They breathed. They shifted. They spoke differently depending on when they were read. This understanding allowed navigators to travel farther from home than previous generations ever imagined. They could follow the logic of currents across wide distances, trust the sky across long nights, and feel the shape of the world through the canoe's soft movements. As they did, a profound calm settled over their voyages. Sailing into unknown regions did not feel like stepping into darkness. It felt like turning a page in a familiar book and discovering a new paragraph. Perhaps surprising, but never frightening. Always part of a larger whole. By the time a navigator reached adulthood, the ocean was no longer a mystery. It was a teacher, a companion, a library without walls. And in that library, the knowledge of generations was preserved, not on paper, but in attention, memory, and the slow transfer of understanding from elder to apprentice. Arcs of ocean. And through these journeys, they left behind something profound. A legacy of quiet mastery. This legacy was not written on stone tablets, nor preserved in carvings on their canoes. It was carried in the minds and behaviors of the people, a way of moving through the world that valued patience over urgency, observation over assumption, calmness over fear. The final generations before recorded history began had, by then, understood something remarkable. The ocean was not an obstacle, it was a connective tissue linking distant lands, distant cultures, distant winds, distant stars. Early navigators recognized the unity of the world long before others could imagine it. Every island belonged to the same sky. Every sky reflected the same patterns. Every swell eventually joined another. Every wind carried the trace of a place it had once touched. Every bird linked distant shores through its flight. Through this interconnectedness, navigators gained a sense of belonging not just to one island, but to the ocean itself. Their identity expanded gently, naturally, without ambition. They became people of the sea. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of their legacy was their humility. Navigators never claimed to discover anything. To them, the sea revealed itself when the time was right. A new island was not a victory, it was a gift, something the world allowed them to witness after countless moments of patience and listening. When they returned home from long voyages, they spoke not of bravery, but of subtle details. A shift in cloud patterns near the western horizon. A slightly warmer current flowing north. A new place where birds gathered at dusk. A reef that produced a low, humming tone beneath the canoe. These small observations enriched the community's understanding. For them, knowledge grew horizontally, not vertically. It spread outward, gently connecting generations. The final chapters of this early age of navigation were marked by an increasing sense of flow. People moved between islands effortlessly. Families visited relatives across distances that once felt immense. Trade widened naturally, not as a pursuit of wealth, but as an exchange of life, stories, plants, and techniques. Navigation became not a specialized skill, but a cultural foundation, woven into songs, metaphors, daily conversations, and rituals. During festivals, children imitated the motions of canoes. Elders recited sky patterns through simple chants. Water bowls were used to demonstrate swell behavior. Small pieces of wood were floated in shallow pools to show how currents shifted. But even with expansion, the culture retained its quietness. There was no need for grandeur. The sea did not reward loud confidence, it rewarded steady attention. As elders approached the end of their lives, they passed on a final teaching to their apprentices, one that remained unspoken for most of their years. You will travel farther than I have. Not because you are greater, but because the sea has shown you more. In this way, each generation carried knowledge from the last, but also extended it just slightly, never dramatically, never suddenly, just enough to honor the world's pace. The legacy of early navigators endured because it reflected natural rhythms rather than human ambition. Their movements echoed tidal shifts. Their memory matched the sky's long turning. Their patience reflected the slow drift of currents. Their humility mirrored the quietness of the open sea. History would later call them explorers. But they were something gentler, something quieter. Listeners. They listened to water. They listened to wind. They listened to birds and clouds and stars. And through listening, they crossed distances that no mapmaker could yet imagine. Their legacy is not a story of conquest. It is a story of cooperation, humans and nature working in harmony, guided by trust rather than force. And as the age of early navigation quietly closed, it left behind a truth still present in the world today. Those who move slowly see far. Those who listen deeply understand much. Those who honor the world's rhythms travel farther than those who rush. The first navigators crossed oceans because they moved at the speed of the sea. Calm, patient, observant. Always willing to wait for the next whisper of guidance. And in their quiet journeys, they revealed the world's true nature. Vast yet knowable. Mysterious yet consistent. Silent yet full of meaning. This is their legacy. A legacy carried not in books, but in the calm, steady hearts of those who follow the water.